Alright, this is the AP Psych video for personality, and we've done the Oreo cookie personality test, so let's move on to personality itself. Psychologists describe it as a complex hypothetical construct that's been defined in a variety of ways, which that's a pretty vague description. And the reason is that it's hard to specifically define personality, but let's take a look at some of the details that might help. Let's take this as an example. Three people stuck in an elevator. How would they behave? Well, one might crack jokes, another might make ominous predictions about how we'll never get out of here, and another might calmly talk of how to escape. These varied responses occur due to personality differences. Each individual has a unique set of personality traits, although some are shared with others. Researchers define a personality as showing a consistent tendency to behave in a particular way, one which is consistent across situations, but is distinctive to the individual. So personality is made up of traits, according to many theorists. Traits are defined as durable ways of behaving in a variety of situations. For an example, a trait might be to be timid, to be conscientious, to be impulsive, to be dependable. Most personality theories assume that some traits are more basic than others. They see a small number of fundamental traits as determining other more superficial traits. Example, if somebody's excitable, that's a basic trait, and it can lead to impulsive, restlessness, irritable, impatient types of behavior. So are there agreed upon basic traits? Cattell, are another one of those valiant researchers who steps into the water of trying to pick a specific list of things that everybody can then bash, chose 16 basic dimensions of personality. And you see them here. Now, interestingly, Cattell not only chose these 16, and you can see them sort of listed on the left and then listed on the right, but he also put in the idea that you'll vary between what seem to be maybe even a little bit different ideas. So, are you reserved? Are you outgoing? Less intelligent? More intelligent? And so forth. So, they have a continuum there to try and look and see exactly where you might be in these 16 basic dimensions. More recently, McRae and Costa, who have done their research from the late 80s to the present, came up with the 5-factor model of personality traits. They say that most traits come from 5 higher-order traits, or the so-called Big Five that you see here. Extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness. And you can see the definitions that they give there. Conscientiousness, careful, dependable, self-disciplined, agreeableness, courteous, good-natured, empathetic, and so forth. Neuroticism, or to be neurotic, is the one that you may not be that familiar with. Now, McRae and Costa claim all personalities can be described adequately by these 5. There's some support for this. In fact, these have been called the longitude and latitude of personality, so they're pretty impressive and have made a pretty big impact on the field. But of course there's criticisms of the Big Five, including that they are purely descriptive. They don't explain why anyone is the way they are. 5 factors may be good, but still that they are arbitrary guesses. And of course there are people who argue that there are more or less than 5. Okay, so are there other theories? There are actually 4 types of personality theories, and oh, by the way, here's your longitude and latitude and your critics. Alright, here's your 5 types of personality theories. First, psychodynamic. Second, behavioral. Third, humanistic. And fourth, biological. Now, it's in this field, of course, that we see the approaches that we've been talking about through the entire year. So, psychodynamic, Freud's view, and his argument will be you are the result of the conflicts within you. The behavioral approach to personality, exemplified by Skinner, you are your environment. Humanistic, you are good and trying to get better. Biological, you are your parents. And a sixth one, the cognitive, a fifth one, the cognitive, which says you are your patterns of thought. So this is not a big surprise to you. Alright, so let's go to Freud and psychodynamic or psychoanalytic theory, depending on how you want to describe it. And of course, this is for not just Freud's ideas, but there are psychodynamic theorists who follow him, who are sort of neo-Freudian, and we'll be talking about them too. But one thing that they all have in common, if they're part of this particular approach, is that they focus on unconscious mental processes as being what creates your personality. So let's talk about psychodynamic theories, or you are what you were. Psychodynamic theories view human behavior as originating from underlying forces that mold your personality, shape your attitudes, and contribute to your emotional behavior. In some dynamic theories, the underlying forces are assumed to be unconscious, in fact, most of them. So let's talk a little bit about Freud's theory. Early in his practice, Freud used hypnosis to uncover the bases of his patients' problems, but he gradually developed his own counseling techniques. His central technique was something called free association, which required the patient to say without censorship everything that came into their consciousness. Now, the reason that he's going to do this is that he believes that if you just listen to people and what they say on the surface, you're not going to get much out of them. But if you listen carefully and look for certain patterns, then you'll find what's really going on beneath the surface. So he's using free association for this. By observing his patients' free associations and by performing thorough self-analysis, Freud developed his complex personality theory, which is known as psychodynamic theory. Freud believed that most behaviors are unconsciously motivated and that people are usually unaware of their true motives and desires. Freud came to believe that, compared to the prominence of the unconscious, the conscious is only the tip of the iceberg, and that's what you see here illustrated in this very important drawing on the right. It tells you a little bit about how Freud saw everything. Freud believed that unconscious motivation explains a variety of behaviors, including neurotic symptoms, phobias, obsessions and compulsions, everyday blunders, dream content, career choices, and personal preferences. He believed everybody unconsciously uses repression, in which events and memories are pushed out of conscious awareness and into the unconscious. Repression occurs when you can't recall crucial memories or important appointments. Generally, people repress more painful memories, such as a dentist appointment, than pleasant memories. Although repression seems to allow individuals to deny and distort reality, the repressed instances do remain in the unconscious and can continue to influence behavior. Unconscious motives also influence social institutions and culture. According to Freud, sublimation is the modification of unacceptable unconscious motives into socially accepted activities. People in the arts, people who are scientists, inventors, religion, business, government, education, military, and sports all represented people who are sublimating, or according to Freud, represent people who are sublimating unconscious motives. Freud proposed, for example, that Leonardo da Vinci's interest in painting pictures of the Madonna was a sublimated expression of wanting intimacy with his own mother, from whom he had been separated at a young age. He also believed that all behaviors are caused by three major structures of personality, and you see his three structures of personality here: the id, the ego, and the superego. Drives are expressed through the three systems and their interactions with each other, according to Freud. So let's start with the id. The id is present at birth, and it's a reservoir of all psychological energies and inherited instincts. To Freud, the id was the true you because it represents the inner world of personal experience. It doesn't care about reality and is unaffected by the environment. The id operates according to something called the pleasure principle, seeking to reduce tension, avoid pain, and obtain pleasure. It contains two competing groups of instincts, the life instinct and the death instinct. And we're not going to get into those because it's a little complicated, but these two are sort of the driving force of the pleasure principle. Now, that leads us to the second part of his system, which is the ego. Now, this is the second system to emerge, and it has to be the referee between the needs of instinct and the demands of society. The ego obeys the reality principle, putting a rein on the id's desire for pleasure until a suitable outlet can be found. The ego, said Freud, represents reason and good sense. And our third component, or Freud's, is something called the superego. He argues that this is the last system of personality to develop, and it represents morality, the rules of parents and society, and the power of authority. The superego consists of the ego ideal, whose moral and social standards you learn are right, or the right thing to do, and the conscience, the inner voice that says you did something wrong. The superego judges the activities of the id, handing out good feelings like pride and satisfaction when you do something well, and handing out miserable feelings like guilt and shame when you break the rules. An old joke summarizes the role of the id, ego, and superego this way. The id says, I want it and I want it now. The superego says, you can't have it, it's bad for you. And the ego, the rational mediator, says, well, maybe you can have some of it later. You can see some representations of the issue between the three here. According to Freud, the healthy personality must keep all three in balance. Someone who's too controlled by the id is governed by impulse and selfish desires. Someone who's too controlled by the superego is rigid, moralistic, and bossy. Someone who has a weak ego is unable to balance personal needs and wishes with social duties and realistic limitations. If a person feels anxious or threatened when the wishes of the id conflict with social rules, the ego has weapons at its command to relieve the tension. These weapons are called defense mechanisms, and they have two characteristics. First, they deny or distort reality, and second, they operate unconsciously. According to Freud, ego defenses are necessary to protect us from conflict and the stresses of reality. They only become unhealthy when they cause self-defeating behavior and emotional problems. Other psychoanalysts came up with more or less, but the following, as we look at them, are going to be a list of a few of those that are usually focused on by contemporary psychologists. So, here's our defense mechanisms. The mechanism of denial, and that's saying that there's no problem, and you can see the example here. Denial occurs when people refuse to admit that something unpleasant is happening or they're experiencing a forbidden emotion. Some people deny that they're angry. Alcoholics may deny that they depend on liquor. In the psychodynamic view, people who assert they never have negative feelings or never feel disgusted by anything are actually revealing denial because everybody tends to do these things. The next one is repression, and this includes the idea that a thought that may come into your mind you'll just repress, but you do so without even being aware of it. In the psychodynamic view, people who say they never remember their dreams or that they never had a bad emotional crisis are likely to be repressing. So again, you're denying reality, but you're doing so in a subconscious or unconscious way. The next one is projection, and that's taking your feelings or beliefs and placing them onto someone else. So this would be something's bothering you and you're embarrassed by it. Let's say you didn't wear the correct clothing to a particular event, so you feel a little self-conscious about it. And while you're at that event, somebody else walks in the room and they're not wearing the right thing, and you make a really big deal out of it. And this is the idea that the reason you're so dedicated to talking about them is to try and you're projecting your own feelings upon them so that you don't feel as bad about it yourself. But remember, the idea is you do this subconsciously or unconsciously. Regression, acting in a way that's not typical for your age. So this is the idea that you probably act more like a child or much younger than you should. Everybody does this, from the youngest people to the very oldest. And when this is occurring, psychodynamic theory would make the argument that there's something beneath the surface that's really troubling you. And so that's why you tend to go back and do those kinds of things. So for those of you who are seniors, perhaps you go back and act like a freshman might, or maybe even somebody in middle school, and you're doing that in order to avoid dealing with something that's more important to you then. Displacement, we've talked about that one before. That's kicking the trash can instead of your friend. Rationalization, the idea that you act like you didn't really care about something that happened, so you just rationalize it. So you don't do well on a test, you say I don't really care, or you have a breakup and you say, well, I didn't really like that person anyway, and so you're rationalizing. Again, you're denying or distorting reality. And we take a look at a couple of others. Intellectualization. This one's an interesting one for AP students, because this is when people have some sort of an impulse that they really don't want to let out, but instead of saying anything about it, they actually study it to death. So they try to kind of overwhelm it by becoming experts on that particular thing. Intellectualization. And identification, we'll pick up with that one on the next segment.